And welcome everyone to the ECO's webinar on our new report, Beyond the Blue Box, Ontario's Fresh Start on Waste Diversion in the Circular Economy. I'm Sarah Robichaud, I'm a Senior Policy Advisor here at the ECO. And just before I formally introduce the Commissioner Diane Sachs, I just wanted to go over a few details about today's webinar, which will provide highlights of the Beyond the Blue Box report, which was released just a few weeks ago, back in October. The full report can be downloaded from our website, which is www.eco.on.ca. And we expect the presentation will take about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions. We are going to hold questions to the end, however, but you can submit them anytime through the panel on the right side of your screen. There's a few different, you should see a few different gray tabs, and one of them says questions. So if you just expand that tab, there will be a window there you can put a question into. If you don't see the question gray line, you should see at least a little orange arrow, and you can click that orange arrow to expand or collapse the full suite of webinar engagement options. And finally, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on our website to view at your leisure. And there, you may also see a raise your hand option on the panel, and we just ask you not to use that, and you can instead just submit questions. With that taken care of, I'll now introduce our Environmental Commissioner, Diane Sachs, to go over the report with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this gray day. Yes, no, not yet. We always have some tech fun here. Are you doing this? Okay, all right. Hopefully you now see the actual PowerPoint. I don't suppose any of you need to know, but who I am. I'm a legislative officer, an independent, impartial watchdog. I'm not from the government. I watch over the government on behalf of the legislature, through them for the public of Ontario. And we are required by law to provide reports every year on these three important topics: environment, energy, and climate. We also have the power to do special reports, and we did a special report on the Waste-Free Ontario Act. The reason we did a special report is it's very rare for Ontario to adopt a significant new environmental statute. The Waste-Free Ontario Act is that, and so we thought it warranted focused attention. And these are the things we ran through in the report, assuming that all of you have the report, or at least have the executive summary, or you can easily download it. We started with the basics. Ontario has a waste problem. We have, in fact, nearly 12 million tons of waste annually. It's almost 1 ton per person. 3/4 of that gets thrown out. In fact, as you'll see later in the industrial, commercial, and institutional sectors, 85% of waste is still going to landfill even after all this time. No surprise that landfilling has environmental consequences. Soil and groundwater pollution uses up precious disposal capacity. It's difficult and expensive to replace. Squanders resources, and an issue particularly concerning to me is that organics in landfill contribute to climate change. Methane from organic waste in landfill is about 100 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. It also contributes to ground level ozone, which is a significant lung irritant. This is generally a really bad thing to put in the air, and at the same time, it's a waste of fuel resource. So we looked a little bit at what had happened in the last 40 years, since I've had the privilege of working through most of that, and lots of other folks forget. The Blue Box began as a voluntary program in the 1970s as there began to be more and more packaging. It began to pile up. So it began as a voluntary program. In 1994, the Ontario government passed a regulation under the Environmental Protection Act that required every municipality with over 5,000 people that collected garbage at curbside to also provide a Blue Box recycling option. And I will say that the Blue Box is exceptionally well loved in Ontario. In fact, at least one survey showed that most Ontario residents think that as long as they throw something in the blue box, they don't seem to be very precise about what, that they have then done their environmental bit for the world, which is pretty far from the truth, but it's a powerful belief. So the Waste Diversion Act, it did expand blue box, and it created 3 other mandatory recycling programs for hazardous waste tires and electronics. And the hazardous waste tires and electronics are primarily because of that hazard of those particular products. Hazardous waste, I suppose, speaks for itself. For tires, I hope you remember or have heard of the big tire fires, and electronic waste. There's a lot of precious metals and toxic metals and other products in it. So getting any of those out of landfill has provided an environmental benefit. In fact, most of the health benefit of the Waste Diversion Act has come from those 3 programs: the hazardous waste, the tires, and the electronics. But what we have seen over the last 40 years is that almost all the focus of the government and almost all the focus of effort has been on recycling. And that probably should be about 5% of the story. It's going to be too expensive to continue to just throw everything away, use it once, throw it away, and then try to recycle stuff. Much more cost effective, create less waste in the first place, and make sure it's designed from the beginning so that A, it lasts, and that B, when it finally does have to be leave its original use, it can be reused in a valuable way for a long period of time. We do recognize that recovery or energy from waste has a role, but it's better than landfill, but it's worse than landfill. So we looked then at the Waste Diversion Act. I remember when the Waste Diversion Act was adopted with a great deal of fanfare and excitement, and there was a lot of hope at the time that it would really be self-supporting. In fact, the deal that the government made at the time, 2000, was that this was going to be a 5-year pilot program, really, because they expected within 5 years things like blue box would be self-supporting. The cost of collecting materials would be less than the value to be gained by selling the materials. That is not what happened. In fact, instead, waste diversion rates stagnated at about 25%, and a lot of the costs have been paid by taxpayers. Now, basically, I said that. The Waste Diversion Act really captured a fairly small part of the overall waste stream, and as you can see, blue box eligible materials, printed papers and packaging, only constitute about 12% of the total waste stream in Ontario. This is all measured on a weight basis, which we know was a very important metric. It's the one that's most commonly used. And of the blue box materials that could go into the blue box, only about 2/3 of them actually were captured. So look at the rest of it. Organics, 28% of the weight by weight, again, it's heavy. Construction demolition waste, about 10%, and very little of that has been used as, for example, recycled aggregate, which is important. Paper and packaging from the ICI sector, very substantial, and very, very little of that recycled or reused. Now, there were other real problems with the Act. There were certainly structural and governance issues with Waste Diversion Ontario and with funding organizations. There was a real lack of transparency and accountability. One of the questions always was, all right, who's responsible for the results? And the ministry looked to Waste Diversion Ontario and said, well, it's your fault. Waste Diversion Ontario was to say back to the government, well, really, it's your fault. You didn't set the right policies, you didn't give us the right things to work with. And the result was that no one took responsibility, which is part of why the result was so poor. We also had really no impact on product design, no impact on creating, or very little impact on creating good markets for recyclable materials, so the regulations are necessary. It just didn't get very far. So we have this great new act, and so our question was, all right, there's a new waste law, there's a new waste strategy. Will anything be different now, other than everybody gets to reprint their business cards? You know, I'm sure, the basics of what's in the Act. We've got these key principles of direct producer responsibility instead of opaque monopolies before. enhanced transparency and accountability measures, more data collection, including from service providers. Enforcement was always a problem with the old act. The ministry kept the enforcement responsibility and power, but again, because they weren't accepting much accountability for the results, they didn't put a lot of emphasis into enforcement, and there wasn't a lot of enforcement. And then we have this visionary idea of the circular economy, a completely different kind of economy, although it isn't at all clear from the Act how the province intends to get there. Now, one of the things the Act did to try to improve transparency and governance is to say policy must now be made in public, with public consultation, and that's something that most distinctly did not happen under the old Act. So this is potentially a very good tool. Instead of the minister waking up one morning and just sending a letter to Waste Diversion Ontario, the minister is required to develop a strategy, to do public consultation on the strategy, and then the strategy is public. So we have this strategy, so that's good. There's a lot of ideas in the strategy, a lot of good ideas in the strategy. Our big concern about it was two things. First of all, there's 100 ideas in the strategy, and anyone with 100 priorities isn't getting any of them done very well because their focus is too scattered. And the second key problem is vagueness. The government, again, had lots of ideas, but not willing to be pinned down on exactly what they were going to do, or when they were going to do it, or how it was going to happen. And so our view was it's really important to have a small number of priorities that are concrete with real deadlines and priorities that are going to be transformative, because tinkering at the edges is not going to solve problems any more than the last 40 years of tinkering have done. So that's kind of what I said. So we made some key recommendations. Number one recommendation has to do with organic waste. We think the province should ban all organics from landfill, and we think they should get at it quickly. Now, this is not rocket science. The small province of Nova Scotia, with fewer than 1 million people, they managed to do this 20 years ago. They did it very effectively. Prince Edward Island has done it. Vancouver has done it. There's a lot of work in this direction in California and in Europe. It's actually not rocket science. But the key thing is, aside from the opportunities to reduce food waste in the first place, again, and a very important thing to do, big problem in Ontario is that we don't have licensed capacity to take food waste and do other things with it. Basically, two main options for dealing with food waste. One is to compost it and make a soil amendment, which we badly need. We've lost about 30% of the organic soil carbon in Ontario agricultural soils in the last generation, and that reduces its resilience to both floods and droughts, increases erosion, which puts pollutants in water, and can make the effect of the content of the food. So there's a huge need for good quality compost. There's also the other thing that can be done with food waste is anaerobic digestion. So some of you may have a chance to look at Every Drop Counts, which was our energy report in the spring, and we looked at the opportunity for co-digestion of co-digestion of food waste with sewage, and sewage biosolids in sewage plants to make methane, which is an energy source that the gas companies can put into the pipeline. So that's, we need those facilities, and the big problem getting those facilities is the Ministry of Environment's approval process for them is very difficult and slow, and so we said you've got to put a high priority on making it possible to get new facilities approved. They've got to meet high quality for public health and environment, but the process has to be much faster and more predictable than it has been up until now. So there's some promises in the strategy. They say they're going to consider a ban, they're going to have an action plan, they're going to monitorize things, but we don't exactly know what that means, and we think it's important that they get on with it and be more specific and soon. Right now, only 40% of the organics developed in Ontario are diverted from landfill, and as you can see, all the rest of it is just going to landfill, and even of the wastes that are diverted, it seems that some of them are going to disposal. I talked already about methane, hugely important from a climate point of view. And we do know that right now the government tends to underestimate methane. They count methane in the official emission estimates as only 21 times worse than carbon dioxide when actually it's closer to 100. I think I said this already. So, yes, there are definite problems in terms of where is it going to go. There are concerns about siting. We know that odor has certainly been a concern. And one of the challenges is that the Ministry of Environment has set a one odor unit standard for organic facilities, which is exceptionally difficult to meet. The province is going to have to make some tough choices here. We recognize this. And there is also a question of expense. It will, at least initially, be more expensive to divert organics than it is to just throw them out, especially if you can send them to states where there is still cheap disposal. But that's one of the reasons it's cheap, is because it doesn't put any value on the methane contamination. It will help, I think, once the Ontario Energy Board adopts its new framework for renewable natural gas for the gas companies, because that will allow them to pay a premium for renewable natural gas pipelines, and that will help improve the economics. I think it's also a question of scale. If we put our focus on making sure that we do have somewhere for all organic waste to go, there will be economies of scale and the cost will come down. There you go. Other people already know how to do this. The second thing that we looked at was the need for really clear recycling standards. The province has some nice words in the strategy that they're going to have environmental standards, but as a former prosecutor, what I know is that very often the government will write things and they're very difficult to enforce. And that's basically the story with source separation for the ICI sectors in 1994. The industry adopted these regulations and then they never enforced them. They've never had much impact. So clear standards, enforceable ones that actually provide a high level of environmental protection. And I think some of you at least have heard me go on about single-use batteries. Calling it recycling to just melt them down and put them in the slag of a smelter doesn't sound to me like either recycling or a high level of environmental protection. We know that, again, there's challenges. One of the things is, first of all, just how to write things that really are clear. One of the reasons that this is often difficult is the government can't foresee everything. However, there's a lot of expertise in the government on regulatory enforcement, regulatory drafting, and we know it's something where a good public consultation process can make a lot of difference in identifying the key issues. Expense is a concern, for sure expense is a concern, but as I indicated earlier, doing what we're doing now isn't sustainable. We can't continue to do it, and so if we move forward, hopefully we will see innovation, we will see opportunities to reduce the costs. And historically, that's usually been what happened when the government proposes a new regulation. Typically, there's lots of complaints, oh, that's going to be too difficult, it's going to be too expensive. Once the regulation is in place, usually smart people find good ways, and it gets cheaper, and in fact, quite often, they find ways to make money. The third major recommendation that we make is in terms of the ICI sector. As I indicated, the ICI sector has really not been pulling its weight. You can see that in the strategy, they say they are going to do something. They're going to update those 3Rs regulations that never worked. They say they're going to implement some disposal bans and designate some new materials, but they don't say what and they don't say when. So one of the things that we've called for is actual deadlines so that we can tell when things are going to happen. As I already indicated, ICI sectors have not been pulling their weight, and you can see where the breakdown is. A huge amount of ICI waste is paper and packaging, and that is fully recyclable, and yet most of it's going to landfill. It's going to landfill because no one has been forced to pay for it, and so when as you know, under the blue box, the cost has been borne partly by the producers, and in most years more than half by municipalities for the ICI paper and packaging sector, because the people who use paper and packaging would have to pay for it. They've tended to do the cheapest possible thing, send it to landfill. This is, again, a fairly easy fix, but it does mean some cost for businesses. Again, scale may help. Other challenges that we always hear about is it's the other person. The landlords say, well, it's the tenants. Tenants say the landlord doesn't provide us with appropriate facilities. And it is true that it can be hard to get people to change what they're used to. But on the other hand, we can also see that a lot of people are interested and enthusiastic about doing something for the environment and are pretty socialized in Ontario about the blue box. So again, we think that there is a very large opportunity for businesses to improve their paper and packaging. But the province has to actually enforce laws. Any regulation where there's no enforcement is really a waste of time. And again, we can learn from Nova Scotia and from the City of Calgary, who's doing a much better job on this. Now, the last part of the report, of our report, as well as of the ministry's strategy is, okay, well, where do we go from here? How do we get beyond a small amount of, at least cardboard should be repulped instead of going to landfills, to something where we really do use resources over and over and treat them as valuable? So the law and the strategy create this new vision of going from the one way resource extraction, basically pull it out of the ground, make a lot of environmental damage as you produce it and distribute it, use it for a short period of time and then throw it. And that's the way we've done on the Manitoba Mountain Bridge Road for the last few years. It's just not necessary and it's not sustainable. So the idea of the law and the strategy is, how do we change that? It's got to be not just putting more stuff in the laws. It has to mean less stuff being created that's unnecessary. It's got to mean things like making things last. One of the things we reported on last year in our energy report is that all of these equations that we have in Canada, they only look at energy use during operation. They don't look at the embodied energy in the product, and they don't look at durability. So we need to think things differently, or we're not going to be able to provide everyone with a decent quality of living without really completely crashing the world. So one of the things we pointed out is that the government has to be much more aware about markets, much more sophisticated about how it deals with markets. So one of the examples that I regularly point out is, what is the most highly recycled product in North America? It's lead acid batteries.
Yeah.
And that's not because there's a government regulation. There isn't any government regulation. Nobody needs a regulation to force people to recycle lead acid batteries. They get recycled because it's profitable for everyone in the chain to sell on the lead acid batteries back to the smelters. So that's the kind of future that we need to have. If we're going to insist on creating materials that become unnecessary, there has to be some place for them to go that is going to be financially self-sustainable. We've seen over the last 40 years huge swings and crashes in commodities markets, which have, in many cases, destroyed attempts to create markets for end-of-life materials. And that's really going to take some attention both from industry and from the government. How do we create durable, sustainable, profitable markets for any end-of-life materials? And if there isn't a durable, sustainable end-of-life market for a material, maybe we can't use it anymore. And that's an all-of-government challenge. It's not something the Ministry of Environment will be able to do for itself. Public procurement, tremendously important. And I noticed that the Secretary General of the OECD called for that again yesterday. So we do have some hopeful things in the strategy, although none of them are particularly clear. We do know that it is very, very important. Government procurement is immensely powerful. Ontario government, for example, buys about $1.9 billion of goods and services on an annual basis, in addition to the goods and services they're purchasing for the $160 billion of infrastructure that we're now building over the next 12 years, and not paying attention to the footprint of those things is going to have a huge energy, environment, and climate cost. On the other hand, there's also tremendous opportunities to a low waste economy. And Scotland, among other places, is really focusing on that. We know this is a real challenge, right? The circular economy is not something that the government can do by itself. We're talking about cultural issues, economic issues, social issues. We're talking about workforce changes. We're talking about design process changes. We're talking about finding a way to support innovative businesses when in Canada we're notorious for coming up with brilliant innovations and letting them die in the valley of death because we don't have a venture capital and a path to commercialization. So these are really significant challenges. On the other hand, we do have other people we can learn from. I think I already mentioned Scotland. And they started in the right place. Their first question was, how do we make things last? European Union has got a good policy on this. China's very focused. They cannot support 1 billion people with a take, use once, throw away kind of culture. So lots of other people who are struggling with the same issues. So when we sum it up, we said, all right, well, what else will help? Basically, what are the kind of procedures that will be useful for the government to follow as they go once more into the breach of waste policy? So the first one we said was pay attention to what you've done before. The promises, the hopes that are being raised around the new act are pretty much the same ones we heard in 1994 and pretty much the same ones we heard in 2002. Government needs to learn from what they've tried before and do something differently this time, or they'll probably get the same results. The second thing is there have to be real deadlines. You know, it's again, this government has had lots and lots of priorities, lots of ideas. Minister Murray was very, very active in achieving passage of the Waste-Free Ontario Act, which was a significant commitment, but he's moved on. So if the government doesn't have clear deadlines, these things can all leak away into good intentions that don't go anywhere. So, I mean, even if there's a deadline, they might miss it, but it helps focus everyone's mind and helps us hold them accountable. Other kinds of issues are the economic barriers that I already mentioned, and that's where public procurement is a really important role. Making the data publicly available. Government collects a lot of data internally, for example, on public procurement, and they don't share it publicly, so we don't even know what they're doing. Really clear lines of responsibility and accountability, very, very important if we want to see actual results. We do know that there's an election coming. That is, having a fixed election date has meant that the entire government has gone into election mode much earlier than usual, and that means it's particularly hard to get things done. The waste sector has got an extraordinary number and diversity of vocal stakeholders, which can make it hard to make changes. And there has been a real lack of common ground as to, well, what happened already, why didn't it work? And we've tried to help with that in our report, sort of setting out what we hope is a nonpartisan and reliable take on how did we get here and what are the problems moving forward. And we're really glad to have such good feedback from stakeholders of all sides. So there we are. We've got time for real innovation. It's not something the government is going to be able to do by itself. They're really going to need some leadership by the folks in the front line, which I know include some of you. If you want to see the report, you're welcome to find it on our website as well as all of our other reports. And I should just say before I leave that I hope you're all aware of our environmental alert service. If you want to get an email to your inbox anytime the government posts an environmentally significant proposal or decision that's of interest to you, they don't have any way to do that on their software right now, but there is a tool on our website if you go to sign up for our environmental registry alerts. So thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them to the best of my ability.
All right, thanks very much, Commissioner. So now we're going to start taking some questions from the audience. So as a reminder to everyone participating, if you can submit your questions using the question and answer pane on the GoToWebinar window on the right side of your screen. And if you don't see that question tab, you can just click the orange arrow out to expand the control panel, and then you should see the question option on the list there. So the first question we've got is I know something we've thought about a lot in this office, so I'm excited to hear your answer, Commissioner.
Uh-oh.
Most recyclable markets are global in scope, so how can one province affect stability of global markets?
Yeah, I didn't say I had all the answers. What we're trying to do is come up with the questions. We do know that that is very challenging, but it's going to help that the EU and China are also looking for the same thing, is to find a way to get away from a high-waste economy. We've pointed out the importance of public procurement in providing a vital early market for innovations. And it may be that the question may have to be, all right, not how do we find a market for this material, but what materials already have markets, and maybe we should use those. So this idea that it's okay to just create a material because it's got benefits in use and ignore the end-of-life consequences of that material, that's what's led us to the current situation where we end up with a whole pile of stuff at the end of the pipe. We know from other parts of pollution control that that doesn't work. It costs too much and it produces generally really bad results. We have to go back up to the beginning. And what we see in Europe is a lot of attention being paid to, all right, how do we change how we make things? How do we change what materials we put in things? Even small things like what glue do you use for the labels can make a difference on the recyclability of a material at the end of its life. If producers have that responsibility from the beginning, then they may have to choose materials for which there is a market. It's also maybe something where we need cooperation between jurisdictions. We know we need that on climate issues. It wouldn't be surprising that we need it on material flows. Not a perfect answer, but we know that doing things the way we're doing it now is not okay.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is something I know is near and dear to your heart. So one of the big problems in Ontario is that municipalities differ in terms of what can be recycled. And I think I'd say more broadly, the range of programs as they exist in each municipality can differ pretty significantly. So how do you think we should deal with this?
One of the reasons that municipal programs have varied so much is that so much of the cost of recycling has fallen on municipal taxpayers, and they vary very substantially in their ability to do so. As the blue box transitions into a producer pay responsibility finally, the expectation is that the producers will unify what they do and where they do it and how they do it. I understand that's what they've been doing in British Columbia, for example. And that will have a number of advantages. One is it should reduce customer confusion, which may help with the contamination rates. We have hugely high contamination rates, which very adversely affect the market and reusability of the materials. We may also see an opportunity for producers to say, all right, what if we do actually, now that we're getting all of our materials back, can we make them less expensive to handle by the way we design them differently? There will also be, I think, a centralization of the information to the public. Again, this was a municipal responsibility, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Most people don't pay a lot of attention to municipal boundaries. They live in one and work at another, and maybe their grandmother's in the next one over. And so when there's province-wide consistent basket, it'll be easier for people to understand, and the information will be the same. I would say the same thing about extending the same rules to ICI, the institutional, commercial, and industrial sectors. If people can handle their organics or their blue box materials the same way at work that they do at home, that ought to improve compliance, reduce contamination, and reduce confusion. So that's what Nova Scotia did. Again, Nova Scotia is a small province, and they still managed to bring in a province-wide green bin system 20 years ago. We could do that too.
Okay, so the next question we have, I'm sure you're going to love. Do you see a role for the cap and trade regulation in helping to drive waste diversion, specifically as it relates to organics diversion from landfills? Would you recommend a global warming potential of 100 for, much. Sorry,
For
I'm reading
methane.
yeah, I think that's for methane. 100 for methane, quantifying emissions reductions from methane in the offset program.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. All right, so I do think that the first thing that will help is the Energy Board framework for renewable natural gas. We know that the gas companies are pretty focused on the need to get renewable content into their pipelines. And if, depending on where the Energy Board sets the price for that renewable natural gas, that may be enough to create a real pull for organic production. There would be an additionality concern if offsets were trying to be used for the same thing. And we will be reporting on offsets in our climate report, which is going to be in a couple of months. One of the things in valuing offsets, though, is that they have to match the compliance obligation that the offset's being used for. So if you think about it, the whole point of an offset is to allow the capped emitters, basically people using fossil fuels, to emit more from the fossil fuels in exchange for offsetting somewhere else. So the counting mechanisms have to be the same. And right now, admittedly, they are very imperfect, but at least the same assessment report for method is being used on both sides of the game. What may make more sense as opposed to offsets is maybe there is some value in using cap and trade money to help with the transition to better methane capture, so with the capital costs and so on. The cap and trade money is required to be used to reduce or support the reduction of greenhouse gases in Ontario. And we know that by far the best use of that money in terms of genuine reductions is to use it for the uncapped sectors, and methane from waste is an uncapped sector. So that would be a very interesting way to use some of that money if there are obstacles in getting from here to there, mostly being capital costs.
Okay. Lots of questions about the organics issue. So the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change has just established a 1-year service standard for reviews, I believe that's for application reviews, unless the reviewer requests additional information. Thus, it can still take 1 year to get approval on, even if you have a perfect application. This is still a long time frame. What are real meaningful changes that the government can make to allow industry to build facilities faster? Could they perhaps rely more on compliance than on approvals?
Well, I mean, the obvious question is whether they could use the environmental activity and sector registry approach for some of this. As you probably know, and if you're not familiar with it, you can look at Chapter 2 of the Good Choices, Bad Choices report that we just issued. We've got an extensive discussion as to how the Ministry of the Environment has been modernizing its approval framework to allow lower risk facilities a faster route to approval. Now, I don't know whether organics facilities would ever qualify as low risk because the odor issue is really important to neighbors. I agree with you that a year is a long time. I think the bigger issue, having spent much of my career trying to get approvals for clients from the Ministry of the Environment, is not just the year, although I agree that that's a big problem. It's the unpredictability and whether or not the conditions that are going to be set are a level playing field among competitors, and also whether they can be complied with. I mentioned the one odor unit as often really difficult to comply with. A sweaty person walking by wouldn't meet the one odor unit limit, for example. So the path forward there, I think, is to have the ministry standardize as much as possible what are they looking for in terms of conditions. If you think about, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the risk assessment process for contaminated sites, but one of the things the government did was they said, all right, we look for a certain series of standard things, and if you have any of the following methods of dealing with your contamination, we will accept that. We're not going to have an argument with you about whether this, and this is okay under these circumstances. And that could simplify the approval process a lot. So even if they took some kind of a hybrid approach where as much as possible, the conditions for an organic, a composting site or an anaerobic digestion site were standard and predictable from the beginning. That, I think, would help a lot in terms of getting investment. But yes, a year is a very long time, and that's a year unless they ask for information. So again, sets a high priority on the ministry being absolutely clear from the beginning what information do they need to see so that there aren't those further delays.
And so this next question sort of touches on an issue we heard a lot about when you did the call-in show on CBC.
Trash can confessions.
Trash can confessions. If anyone wants to look it up, it was an entertaining hour. When it comes to organics, the question asker says, I think that compostable plastic bags are what makes a difference. In Ottawa, all organics must be disposed of in plastic bags, which tend to make, in paper bags, which tend to make people squeamish. Can you speak on compostable bags for organics?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't in this office done any deep dive on compostable plastics. What I hear from the industry is a few things. First of all, I know from my work in private practice that plastics can cause huge problems in organics. They can clog the machinery, and they can allow things to rot and become really, really stinky. So plastics are a big problem in terms of odor control, which, as I've already indicated, is typically the biggest challenge in both approvals and compliance. The second thing about plastics is that they do tend to increase the cost of operation. And the third thing about them is that although compostable plastics are supposed to break down in the, they are capable of breaking down. What I hear is that they don't break down as fast as the rest of the organics. So they would have to stay in the process longer, which means that, again, the cost is higher, and it means you need much more capacity because the throughput is reduced. I understand the significance of the yuck factor. So the paths forward might be some combination of, well, when I was little, we didn't have compostable plastics. We also didn't have plastic bags. We had wax paper, which wasn't all that bad. So maybe there are better paper bags that are available. On the other hand, maybe compostable plastics can be made that actually do break down just as fast as the food waste itself. And, you know, one other thing is to think about, all right, how do we make it easier for people to move the stuff around? One of the innovations that I really liked that was an apartment building in Toronto was having a lot of trouble getting people to carry their organics downstairs. They didn't want to do that. So they said, all right, and they converted the garbage chute from garbage to organics because people are actually not that unhappy carrying down their cardboard. And if they can't carry their cardboard down today, nothing bad happens. So they chained all the doors to the chutes so that they have only a small opening. People could only put organics down. They did spend 6 months getting everybody ready for this. And if you take your dry recyclables downstairs, there's an easy place to put them, and they've had a really good result in making people comfortable with both separating their organics and putting them in the right place. So I think more attention to that kind of behavioral facilitation, maybe with pails or other kinds of things, maybe that would help.
Okay, and the next question, again, deals with organics. Obviously, this is an issue that resonates with lots of people. So it says, allowing a faster and effective compliance system for anaerobic digestion is great, but success in waste management often requires broader participant involvement. And so the question they have is about what efforts are being made, and maybe I'll modify that and say, or could be made, for community composting being allowed in neighborhoods and encouraging more local level composting efforts.
Well, that's a great idea. You know, one of the visions of the future that I saw years ago was, all right, what if basically every block had to keep its garbage? You'd have every block or every small community, you'd have someone whose job it was and who was paid by the rest of the community to compost the organics and separate and organize the cardboard and so on. It's I mean, I personally compost in my backyard. I know that a lot of my neighbors do. And I think it makes a lot of sense to keep waste local, keep people familiar with it. In Germany, one of the interesting things is that every school class has to go to see the transfer sites and the landfills, everywhere their waste goes. They have to see it once as fairly small kids in primary school and once in high school, so they get a more sophisticated understanding. So that people don't think anymore that when you just put something in a bin, it's then away. And I think the idea of local composting can do a lot of things from that point of view, as well as providing really good quality compost for people's gardens. So that would be a great idea for the government to do. I think it would also be something that would be interesting for an industry group or a municipal group or an ENGO to come up with basically a protocol. And that would actually be a perfect example for an ESER. So go back to the Environmental Activity and Sector Registry, and again, I refer you to that chapter in Good Choices, Bad Choices. This is something where you could, any two of you, write a request for review asking the government to adopt a policy on an environmental issue. And this would be a great one. Ask them to establish an ESER registration system for community composting. And that might make a really big difference. Thank you for the suggestion. We hadn't thought of that before.
Okay, next question, getting a little bit more technical. What are your thoughts about plasma gasification for low-grade plastics? Items that are tough to sell on the open market, like milk cartons are a specific example they provided.
Well, we indicated that we understand that there is a role for energy recovery from waste. And I certainly wouldn't be the person to say whether plasma gasification is the way to do it or not. But in principle, I agree. I mean, spending $2,000 a ton to recycle in a septic container doesn't make any sense to me from an environmental or an economic point of view. So I think that there is a role if we can make really good use of the heat. And ideally, the heat and the steam, and again, keep the higher priority things first. Region of Durham has got, and York, as you know, has an energy from waste facility, and they are going to have to work hard over the years to find the right balance. So far, they're doing pretty well. They've got very high diversion rates in both of those municipalities, higher than most other places, and they're going to have to do more as their population grows because they undersize the facility to make sure that the squeeze would be kept on.
So this next question deals with some of the content from the new long-term energy plan that was released earlier this week, I believe. So they ask, if biogas facilities are viewed as an important factor in organic diversion, but the feed-in tariff program is no longer in place and no renewable natural gas program is in place yet, how will potential new plants justify building their sites to their financial lenders in such a short time frame? So I guess that question of how these waste diversion goals tie in with broader energy planning. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's an excellent question, and I hope you noticed our report last December on the long-term energy plan, where we emphasize the absolute urgency of those two ministries working together, that the Ministry of Energy Policies and the Ministry of Environment Policies have to be consistent. The feed-in tariff was for electrical generation, as you know, and we don't need more new electricity supplies at the moment in the short term, according to the long-term energy plan. So renewable natural gas makes much more sense on an energy balance point of view, and as I indicated, the Energy Board is working actively on this. Yes, it's too bad that there's a gap, but they're going as fast as they can. And I personally have been encouraging the Energy Board on how important this is, and I think they understand that.
Okay, so I'll just note to our listeners that we just have time for 2 more questions that are already in the queue. So unfortunately, there's no time for additional questions, but of course you can always send any inquiries to us, and I'll provide some additional contact information at the end of the webinar, in addition to our general commissioner at eco.owen.ca account that you can always send any feedback or comments to.
And I'd encourage you to call Sarah.
Yeah, I'm going to give my email at the end. So the second to last question we have is from your research. What is the feeling of the private sector, i.e. producers, about this new Waste Free Ontario framework?
Well, it's interesting. As some of you know, I was counsel for the municipalities in the very antagonistic arbitration about blue box funding in 2014, and at that point, relations between the producers and the municipalities was at an all-time low. The success of the municipalities in that arbitration, I think, really made a big difference. The producers had to realize that the old days were over, that they were going to be now moving towards paying much closer to full 50%, and after that, finally going to producer pay. So I think that I spoke to the Canadian Stewardship Alliance a couple of days ago, and they were very interested in, all right, well, where do we go from here? How do we pull our weight? How do we do it in a way that's going to be more cost effective? Stewards have long believed that the system designed in 1994 of having each municipality do recycling was inefficient. One of you asked me earlier about the differences in the basket and so on. And they felt, we run really sophisticated logistical systems around Ontario, around the world. We think we can do this better if we have control. And so there's a lot of interest in, okay, well, how can we actually make this work? How can we make it work in a way that is less hostile, less confrontational, and it's just going to work better and get better results than what's been happening in the last 2 years. So nobody likes having to pay more. I think that's fair, but that battle is over. Now the question is how to do it as smoothly and as successfully as possible, and where will the innovation opportunities be for some companies to do better. One of the things I heard from one of the big producers is they see a real appetite among consumers for better environmental performance products, and maybe we'll see some of that flowing through finally into better design of products and packaging.
Okay, so the last question is, how do you ensure that stewardship organizations go beyond the minimum program operation standards? Is this a symptom of too broad or too vague priorities as outlined by the regulator?
Well, I talked earlier about the need for really clear enforceable standards. That sets the minimum. If you have regulatory standards, if they're clear and enforced, that gives you the floor. If you want more than the floor, there has to be some incentive. That incentive is typically economic, although it isn't always. It can be a customer pull. And of course, it can be a successful market, which is, we said earlier, we think ought to be the government's priority. So the cultural shift that we talked about is certainly part of it. Young people growing up, they do know that their future is at stake if we don't get smart from a climate point of view. At least many of them do. And so I think that the combination of a better economic incentive and better data and the growing cultural shift will help give people some incentive, some people anyway, an incentive to go beyond the floor. But at a minimum, we need the floor, and that's the role of government. So thank you so much for those great questions. I hope that I was able to give you at least some kind of answers. If you have further questions about it, as I say, please call Sarah.
Yeah, so on that note, this concludes our Beyond the Blue Box webinar with a really amazing set of questions from the attendees. As a reminder, the full report and the archived webinar will be available from our website, which is www.eco.on.ca. We'll also send a follow-up email in the next couple of days that will include that link for you. And as mentioned, if you have any further questions about the report or just feedback you want to provide to us, you can send that to me. And my email address is Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, .robicheau, ROBICHEAU, @eco.on.ca. You can also send emails just to the the general commissioner account, and they will find their way to me, I promise. So on that note, thanks for joining us today. I hope you all learned something and found it informative. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone.